The narcissist wants you to be his mother. The narcissist tests your unconditional love with his narcissistic abuse. I've dealt with all this in the Shared Fantasy playlist on this channel. Today, I'm going to add to our understanding of these seriously twisted dynamics. The narcissist wants you to hold him and he wants you to contain him. What does it mean? Holding is a term proposed by Donald Winnicott, the famous pediatrician turned psychoanalyst and one of the fathers of the object relations school. According to Donald Winnicott, holding is a process where the mother provides an environment within which the child can evolve and grow. And the mother does this by essentially taking over the negative aspects of the child's emerging mind and providing the child with a sense of safety and security. She's a secure base. She allows the child to evolve without fear of punishment or untoward consequences from the mother. The concept of containment was first proposed by Wilfred Bion, a French psychoanalyst. Containment means that the mother absorbs from the child's negative emotions, frustration, and aggression. She holds on to these negativities. She processes them. She reframes them. And when the child is ready, she hands them back. This way, the child feels safe all the time. The mother is sufficiently strong and resilient to cope with the child's negative effects, with the child's emerging aggression and hostility, with the child's envy, and with other parts of the child that the child finds unacceptable, intolerable, unbearable, and even threatening. The narcissist wants you to do the same. He wants you to provide an environment wherein he can reenact the dynamic that he has had with his original biological mother, on the one hand, and he wants you to be the receptacle and container of all his overflowing negativity. He wants you to be strong. He wants you to be resilient. He wants you to absorb his negativity and, when ready, hand it back to him. The narcissist is a child, psychologically speaking. Most narcissists are between the ages of 2 and 3 years old. We have extensive knowledge about the psychology of children at these ages, and I'm going to apply now the principles of holding and containment to the emergence of pathological narcissism in children who have been unfortunate enough to grow with dead mothers, mothers who are not good enough. Sometimes you come across treasures in the most unexpected places. In between heavy, thick-set tomes of non-fiction, I indulged myself secretly with a thriller, psychological thriller, well-written, captivating, edge of the seat, page-turner, titled The Silent Patient. The author is Alex Michaelides, or in the wrong American pronunciation, Alex Michaelides. As I was reading the book, I suddenly came across the following passages. Babies are trapped in a strange alien world, unable to see properly, constantly surprised at our bodies, alarmed by hunger and wind and bowel movements, overwhelmed by our feelings. We are quite literally under attack. We need our mother to soothe our distress and make sense of our experience. As she does so, we slowly learn how to manage our physical and emotional states on our own. Our ability to contain ourselves directly depends on our mother's ability to contain us. If she had never experienced containment by her own mother, how could she teach us what she did not know? Someone who has never learned to contain himself is plagued by anxious feelings for the rest of his life, feelings that Bion aptly titled Nameless Dread. He's referring to Wilfred Bion, B-I-O-N. Such a person, continues Michaelides, such a person endlessly seeks this unquenchable containment from external sources. He needs to have a drink or a joint to take the edge off this endless anxiety. As Winnicott put it, a baby cannot hate the mother without the mother first hating the baby. Good enough mother starts off with an almost complete adaptation to her infant's needs. A fairly profound passage in a book that otherwise is just a psychological thriller. And it leads me to discuss today the concepts of holding, containment, and what preceded both, projective identification, at least Melanie Klein's version of it. My name is Sam Vaknin. I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, and I'm a professor of psychology. One could say that the root cause of pathological narcissism is a lack of containment and holding in early childhood. But in order to understand that really deeply, we need to go back several decades to Melanie Klein and her concept of projective identification, which is a bit different to the way we see projective identification today. Klein said that the infant attempts to rid itself of unpleasure, sensations, experiences, unpleasantness, the opposite of the pleasure principle. In short, one could say that the baby is trying to rid itself, to get rid of reality, when reality intrudes. So originally, projective identification was this process that today we call projection. It's when you have parts of you, could be cognitions, could be emotions, could be traits, could be states of mind, parts of you that you find highly uncomfortable, that you reject, that are unpalatable, that challenge your self-concept. And you want to get rid of these parts because they cause dissonance and anxiety. So you project them. And early on in the psychoanalytic movement, the belief was that the baby projects these parts to anyone, never mind the final destination. Not necessarily to the mother, but since the mother happens to be there 99% of the time, she ends up being the target of the projection. Melanie Klein disputed this. She said that projective identification, or what we call today projection, is an attempt to project the intolerable, unbearable, unacceptable, unpalatable fragments, the ego-dystonic fragments, as the ego is emerging. So she said the mother is definitely the target. She said this projection is into the mother. Klein believed that projective identification takes place actually not in any real space. It takes place in the baby's fantasies with PH. Everyone has fantasies with PH, and the whole process of projection, I am disowning, I'm rejecting the parts of me that I cannot accept. She said this doesn't happen really. It's not like the baby approaches the mother and says, there's a part of me I don't like, and I would like you to own it. I would like you to have it. I'm projecting it onto you. That's not the way it's done. But the baby creates a fantasy in his or her mind. And in this fantasy, mother is represented and the baby is represented, and they exchange these parts. The baby projects onto the mother within the fantasy. And so it's never a question of the baby or the infant, as Klein said, literally put things into the mother's mind and body. That's not the way it is. By the way, a great summary of her thinking about projective identification you can find in Spilius, Spillius, 1992. Here's what Klein had to say. These excrements and bad parts of the self are meant not only to injure, but also to control and take possession of the object, in this case, the mother. Insofar as the mother comes to contain the bad parts of the baby's self, she is not felt to be a separate individual, but is felt to be the bad self. Klein, 1946. So here's a summary of what Klein is saying. She's saying that the infant is born into the world with a sense, some vague sense, that there is a distinction between itself and an outside external object. Klein believes that the baby is born essentially with the rudiments of an ego, and the baby does experience selfhood and personhood, and does realize that there is an object, there is a person, there is a human being, there is something outside the baby, something that is not the baby. By the way, the most recent bleeding edge research in neuroscience tends to support what she says. And so she says the baby is born with this distinction. And the baby realizes explicitly that it can use projective identification to expel bad parts. But she says then a regression happens. The baby is born with the ability to tell the difference between itself and mother. But as the baby projects the bad parts onto mother, as the baby forces mother to adopt the parts of itself that the baby cannot accept, there is a merger or a fusion. Now, some elements of the baby, some parts of the baby, some components of the baby reside in mother, belong to mother. Mother is comprised of these parts, but these parts belong to baby. So projective identification is a kind of glue that merges the baby with the remaining good parts with mother, who is now the container, the repository of the bad parts of the baby. And so it blurs the distinction between baby and mother. This is a very, very unusual, idiosyncratic view. Melanie Klein conflicted with most of the other scholars in the psychoanalytic movement and outside it, object relation schools and so on. Everyone thinks that the baby, when the baby is born, there is a state of symbiosis or merger and fusion with the mother. And only gradually does the baby detach from mother. Separation, individuation, becomes an individual, divided. Whereas Klein says exactly the opposite. She says the baby is born as an individual. Baby is born with an ego. Baby is able to tell the distinction between itself and mother. And then the baby realizes that there are parts of itself that it cannot accept. Baby rejects these parts. He hands them over to mother. She owns these parts. These parts become mother. But now, mother is just an extension of baby. And so, there's a total merger between mother and baby. Exactly the opposite of what everyone else thinks. Paula Hyman and Roger Money Curl analyzed this in therapeutic settings, applied these ideas to countertransference and so on and so forth. So anyone who wants to learn more can study their work. Paula Hyman and Roger Money Curl. Okay. I disagree with Klein in my work, as some of you may know. First of all, I don't believe that the baby hands over the bad aspects, the bad parts, to mother, because that would mean that mother becomes a bad object. A baby would be terrified to conceive of mother as a bad object, because if mother is bad, mother could neglect the baby, could starve the baby, or could kill the baby. So it's a terrifying thought that mother is bad. So I don't believe the baby hands over the bad parts. I actually think the baby hands over the good parts. The baby becomes all bad. Mother becomes all good. There's a splitting defense taking place. The baby splits both itself and mother. Baby retains all the bad parts. Mother retains all the good parts, at least initially. Later on, during the process of separation individuation, there is an integration of the bad aspects of mother and the good aspects of mother, the bad breast and the good breast, in Melanie Klein's evocative language. But initially, very early on, the baby would rather much prefer, to think of itself as all bad and of mother as all good. Indeed, I'm not alone in this objection. Fairbairn, one of the geniuses of psychology in the 1960s, Fairbairn suggested the moral defense, saying exactly the same. And much before both of us, there was Strachey in the 1930s with his primitive superego. The second point where I strongly disagree with Klein is that I believe, like most other scholars, that the distinction between self and object, between internal and external, this distinction grows with time and experience, whereas Klein says that this distinction diminishes with time and experience, and this flies in the face of all observations, all studies, and all theoretical considerations. I think she has been wrong about this. Bion, the aforementioned Bion, French psychoanalyst, showed how projective identification in the Kleinian sense can be used to tackle the issue of the self and object. Remember that in pathological narcissism, one of the core problems is a narcissist's inability to tell the difference between himself and everyone else out there. Inability to tell apart external objects from internal objects, the conversion of external objects into internal objects. The narcissist is unable to accept or even to recognize the separateness and externality of other people. Other people are extensions of the narcissist's mind, figments of his imagination, playthings in his mind pen. They're just internal objects which can be manipulated at will and are pretty fixated and inert. So this is the core issue in pathological narcissism. And so the study of the relationship between the self and external objects is very crucial to the understanding not only of pathological narcissism, but I could generalize and say of mental illness in general. Originally, there is an inchoate sense of self and a very conflicted, ambiguous relationship with objects, with external objects. What Bion has added to the picture is the idea that if the baby were to use projective identification excessively, this could be used to attack the linkage, the bond, the connection between self and object. Originally, projective identification is intended to defend against psychic pain, the baby's, the infant's psychic pain. Klein says that the infant's psychic pain is the pain of, oh my God, I'm bad. There are parts of me which are bad. I want to get rid of these parts. So I'm going to ship them away to mother. There's also an issue of envy. We'll not go into it right now. Okay, so this is Klein. I agree with Klein that there is a psychic pain, but I think she misidentified the psychic pain. I think the psychic pain is, oh my God, Mother is bad. Mother is frustrating. Mother is absent. This is a terrifying, intolerable thought. And so the baby has to get rid of it. And the only way to get rid of it is by exporting, shipping, sending to mother the good parts of the baby so as to render her all good, even as the baby assumes the bad parts of the mother, what is known as an internalized bad object. The awareness of reality, when the baby first comes across the fact that mother is external, mother is separate, she has her own wishes and needs and priorities. She does not respond to the baby's needs 100% of the time. She is not at the baby's beck and call, at the baby's service. Baby comes across these facts of reality. The baby withdraws into fantasy. Here I agree with Klein. And then resolves this frustration, not with aggression, but with a reallocation of the good and bad aspects of reality. Mother now is the container of all good aspects, and the baby remains with what is left, the bad dimensions of existence. If we accept that the infant in Bion's conception is busy all the time, using cycles of projection and projective identification and introjection and, constantly rearranging the furniture in its mind, and by interacting with the object all the time, one way or another, the infant or the baby creates a bond. This constant activity strengthens the linkage with the object, with mother, and it provides succor to the emerging self or the developing ego. Of course, a baby that is prevented from doing this because mother is non-responsive, or mother is absent mentally or physically, or mother is selfish, or mother, in short, mother is a kind of dead mother. A baby that has this kind of mother, who is deficient, not good enough mother, won't be able to transact with her, won't be able to share with her the good and bad parts, to reallocate them, won't be able to indulge his fantasies, or the baby's fantasies, and so on. And so this kind of baby would end up growing up to be mentally ill. We'll come to it a bit later. So this is Bion's baby, constantly projecting, introjecting, and thereby bonding with the mother. Winnicott's baby is a bit different. Winnicott said, remember the different background. Donald Winnicott was a pediatrician. He knew children very intimately. I can't say this regarding Bion. Winnicott was much closer, let's say, to Mahler or to Piaget rather than to Bion. Bion was a theoretician. Winnicott had hands-on experience with infants and toddlers and babies and newborns and so on and so forth. And he said that it's a waste of time to hypothesize about what goes on in the baby's mind throughout this early stage. He said, the only thing we can be sure of is that the baby somehow interacts with the mother. If we are trying to create a mental map, an imaginary landscape of the baby's mind, emerging mind, ego, self, you name it, call it as you wish. If we are trying to create this and we don't introduce the mother into this, we are wasting our time. The only thing which we can be sure of from observations, based on observations, is this intimate connection between mother and child. So it's safe to assume, said Winnicott, that mother and child are a single unit, and it is mother who is in charge of all the psychological processes. The baby is absolutely dependent on the mother. The baby is what he called unintegrated. So initially the mother takes over the role of generating psychodynamics, psychological dynamics, putting together psychological constructs, endowing the child with the equipment and the platforms, the templates needed to later emerge as a person with a self and an ego and whatever. It's very similar to the fact that it is the mother who endows the child, the newborn, with gut bacteria. So these are mental gut bacteria. Bion's infant is actually an agent, independent, is aware of the object. Bion's infant makes decisions to use specific primitive mechanisms, positively or negatively, when interacting with the mother. Bion's infant is therefore pretty independent, autonomous, and agentic, while Winnicott's infant is a mess. Winnicott's infant is unaware of the separate existence of the mother. It is integrating with the mother, especially if the mother is a good enough mother. And this process of integration is very crucial, because only then can the mother equip her child to later become separate from her. On the one hand, Bion came up with the concept of reverie. Reverie in the interaction with the infant. The mother engages in reverie. We'll talk about it a bit later. And on the other hand, we have the good enough mother in a state of what Winnicott called primary maternal preoccupation. In 1962, Winnicott suggested that the good enough mother plays an inherently positive role in the development of the infant. Just by being present, her presence fosters the kind of continuity that he called going on being, and I call becoming. Mother's presence is crucial because she is like the foil, she's like the screen on which the baby can project everything, experiment with everything, discover itself through the mother's gaze. So the infant moves initially towards a stage of greater integration because it needs to leverage the mother, to use the mother in order to ultimately reject her, separate from her. You can already see the rudiments of the narcissist's shared fantasy. This is exactly what happens. Baby idealizes mother, attributes to her everything that's good, merges with her, becomes one symbiotically, just in order to be able, having developed all the necessary psychological equipment, to reject her, to discard her in effect. Narcissists are stuck at this extremely early stage and keep reenacting this dynamic because it did not end well initially, originally, and it never ends well later. The good enough mother is a state of heightened sensitivity and responsiveness to the needs of the infant. In 1956, Winnicott compared it to an illness. He said that the good enough motherhood is a delicate adaptation to the needs of the infant. Kind of infection, if you wish. That's his words, not mine. Winnicott vehemently disagreed with Klein, and I'm being gentle. As far as Winnicott was concerned, the question whether the baby has a strong ego or a weak ego or any ego at the start of life, the beginning of life, it's a meaningless question. A question that in principle cannot be answered. He said instead of focusing on this non-decidable question that we can never answer, why don't we focus on what we are observing? And what we are observing is the mother's ability to cope with infant's absolute dependence. The mother uses her ego, herself, and lends it to the baby, gives it to the baby. The baby uses the mother's ego and the mother's self as an auxiliary. Actually, says Winnicott, it's very likely that the baby regards the mother's ego, the mother's self, as its own ego, as its own self, a state that Mahler called symbiotic phase. As far as Winnicott is concerned, the term ego is, as he defined it, the part of the human personality that tends, under suitable conditions, to become integrated into a unit. So as far as Winnicott is concerned, in his writings in 1962, the ego was what we call in physics a field of potentials. It was a potential field of potential, so that this potential could become an integrated, constellated, fully functional ego or self, or call it as you wish. Could become. The potential was there. And Winnicott insists that the crucial determinant of whether these potentials will materialize and produce a healthy adult or not, the crucial determinant is the mother. By the way, John Bowlby of attachment theory fame agreed fully. Winnicott said that initially there is some kind of excitement. There's a primitive love impulse. This primitive love impulse is very reminiscent of Freud's id. Winnicott believed that one can always, as he put it, detect reactive aggression, since in practice there is no such thing as a complete id satisfaction. In other words, Winnicott introduced into the equation what we today call frustration. Baby wants to be fed, mother is away, outside the room. Baby's diapers are wet, baby cries, mother is not available. Whenever mother denies the needs of baby, ignores baby's temper tantrums and crying, baby is frustrated, baby is rageful, angry, baby wants to destroy the bed object mother. That's a terrifying state of mind, because with mother gone, baby is dead. Baby needs urgently to reframe the whole situation and say, mother is all good, she is not attending to my needs because I'm all bad. This impulse that Winnicott describes, what he called the primitive love impulse, what Freud called the id, this impulse may be destructive by chance when the infant has not attained ego integration. And this is exactly the path that leads to disordered narcissism, dysfunctional pathological narcissism. When the baby's ego is not integrated, the infant would use the primitive love impulse in ways which are basically destructive. And the infant cannot be held responsible for this. The infant is not doing it on purpose. Klein implies that because the baby has an ego, the baby's envious attacks, the baby's aggression is intentional, intended to destroy the frustrating object, mother. Winnicott says this is ridiculous. Baby is aged 1 month, 2 months, 6 months. These babies may not even recognize the externality and separateness of the mother, and definitely are not in the condition to launch attacks deliberately in a premeditated manner. He says they're not developed enough. But he says in due time, as the ego integrates, they're able to take this love impulse, sublimate it, and render it a force for the good, a fount of energy for life. However, if the ego is not integrated, there's been some disruption in the formation of the self, this primordial force, this atavistic force, remains trapped, and it is misdirected time and again, and can even wear the guise of externalized aggression. Aggression is a reaction to frustration, but it needs opposition. When you're aggressive, you need someone to aggress against. If this someone is absent, who would you aggress against? Except in your fantasy, which is the solution that Klein suggested. But Winnicott says, and I fully agree, there's no need for fantasy here. The mother is there. One way or another, the mother is there. She could be a good enough mother. She could be a dead mother. She could be a deficient mother. All true. But she's always there one way or another, except in extremely rare cases. And when I say mother, it doesn't have anything to do with genitalia or biology. Mother is anyone who fulfills the maternal roles, the maternal functions. There's always someone who is doing this. So Winnicott said, mother is there. Why do we need fantasy? Why do we need fantasy? Mother provides the opposition to the aggression. Mother provides an address. Send the aggression to me. I'm here. And so the good enough mother engenders an environment, creates an environment, and allows the child to aggress against her, becomes a punching bag in a way. It is through these cycles of frustration, aggression, Dollard's work, 1939, through these cycles that the baby realizes there is me and not me. I'm aggressing against not me. I'm not aggressing against me. It feels good to aggress. So I can't be the object of this aggression. It feels good to aggress. It means there's someone out there. And if there's someone out there, there is me and the rest of the world, not me. These are the initial buds, the initial emergence of the self. Erotic impulses, described amply by Sigmund Freud, can be satisfied while the object is, as Winnicott put it, subjectively conceived or personally created. But aggressive impulses, and this is mostly the work of Adler, aggressive impulses are unsatisfactory if there's nobody there. In a strange way, aggression is a form of bonding and dependency, which is more extreme than love. You could love someone in your fantasy, in your imagination, as Klein had suggested. You could conceive of a love object subjectively. You can, as Winnicott calls it, personally create the love object. But you cannot do this with your aggression. If you aggress against some imaginary object or in your fantasy, it doesn't feel satisfactory. It doesn't fulfill the role of catharsis. So you need a real person to aggress against. And this is the main role of the mother. The main role of the mother is to push the child away, to frustrate the child, to allow the child to aggress against her, thereby separating and individuating, becoming an I. So it is through the aggressive impulses, through the aggression, and the exercise of aggressive impulses that the infant discovers the shape and form of the environment, and by contradistinction itself. Whenever you define any environment, any set of circumstances, other people, you always do it in this contradistinction to yourself. Whenever you observe something, when I observe this laptop or this water bottle with a lot of microplastics, when I observe them because I'm able to say the water bottle is not me. There is me And there is the water bottle. There's me and there's a laptop. There's me and there's you, the viewers. So the exercise of aggressive impulses allow the child to delineate and demarcate the environment and create initial boundaries, ego boundaries. When there are significant failings in environmental provision, when the child has to use up a lot of energy and motility reacting to breaches of boundaries, impingements, absences, and so on and so forth, when the child is forced to use scarce resources wrongly, non-productively in the ongoing process of constantly attempting to delineate borders between itself and the reality of the outside world, this kind of infant learns that reality is not out there unless you aggress against it. So reality becomes a reactive artifact. Let me explain. That's a bit complex, but it's an astounding insight. Not mine, of course. It's an astounding insight. When the baby experiences frustration, baby's needs are not met, baby is angry, baby then externalizes the aggression against mother. And the minute baby does this, baby realizes there's me, who is the aggressor, and there's mother, who is aggressed against. Mother provides opposition. Mother is there. At that moment, there is me and not me, the emergence of the self, and the foundation of boundaries, ego boundaries. However, when these boundaries are constantly breached, when the mother is a bad mother, she's unable to provide opposition, she's absent, she's selfish, she's depressed, at that point, the baby is not getting the feedback. The baby is aggressing, but is not getting feedback. And the baby starts to believe, because the baby is not getting feedback, baby starts to believe that its own reactions are creating the world, are creating the environment. Since there's no feedback from the meaningful feedback from the environment, which happens to be initially only mother, there's no meaningful feedback, the baby develops a belief that its own actions manifest the world. This is a form of magical thinking. Baby begins to perceive the world as an extension of itself, a pathological process known as hyperreflexivity. Baby becomes essentially pseudo-psychotic, later on narcissistic. It is in the infant's destructiveness and the survival of the object, mother survives the aggression, that some kind of realistic objectivity emerges. A perceived object is created. It's like probing. This aggression is like probing. Winnicott suggested that he characterized infants at these early stages. He said that they're always on the brink of unthinkable anxiety. They're always about to fall to pieces. They always feel that they're self-destructive, and their relationship with the body is very conflicted. He suggested much later, towards the end of his life, I think the last year of his life, he suggested that it's wrong to confine the provision of going on being, of becoming, and the brief experiences of omnipotence to early experiences, like the breast in Klein's work, or to the basics of maternal care. He said, this process of going on being, the mother's contributions to this process of becoming is not limited to the early stages of childhood. There is some kind of continuity facilitated by the mother's face, expressions, gaze. In the early stages, what the infant sees when it looks into the mother's face is as Winnicott said, himself or herself. It is the mother's gaze that defines the baby's self. In other words, says Winnicott, the mother is looking at the baby, and what she looks like is related to what she sees there. If what the infant sees when it looks into the mother's gaze, mother's eyes, the mother's face, if what he sees is only the mother's moods, the mother's defenses, if when the baby looks at mother, he sees only mother, but not itself, baby looks at mother, and in her eyes, there is self-preoccupation. The baby doesn't exist. Mother does not reflect the baby, does not interact with the baby, does not form the baby, does not provide boundaries. Her gaze does not define the baby. Well then, with such a mother, the baby can lose track of its own continuity and being. And at that point, baby becomes extremely uncertain, fails to develop grandiose omnipotence, the kind of grandiose omnipotence needed to say goodbye to mother and take on the world, explore it. You need to be very grandiose. You need to be delusional about your powers, believe that you're godlike, to take on the world and to separate from the only secure base in your life, your mother. And people do this when they're 2 years old. But a baby that has not been reflected by the mother, for all intents and purposes, does not exist and is unable to develop this grandiosity and to venture forth into the world, to separate and to individuate. And the repeated losses accrued every time the baby attempts to discover itself through the mother's gaze, these losses lead to atrophy. The creative capacity of the baby is stunted. There's a failure of the infant's creative gesture because it finds no purchase on the mother's face. And this stifles the baby's ability to perceive, ability to tolerate the moments of doubt and unintegration during the holding phase. We'll discuss the holding phase a bit later. Winnicott says that it is through mother's memories, through mother's narcissism, and through her imagination that mother is able to attain the appropriate level of identification with the baby's needs. Winnicott asserted that, as he said, mothers identify themselves with the baby that is growing within them, and in this way they achieve a very powerful sense of what the baby needs. This is projective identification. So it's a process of de-adaptation. It's gradual, it's incremental, but it takes place inexorably. And baby gradually detaches from mother. The bond frays. Baby begins to look elsewhere for satisfaction, for knowledge, for self-definition. And it's very tough on the mother. The same identical process happens when the child goes through adolescence, puberty. But the mother senses that she should pull back slightly from her near-perfect adaptation. The mother knows that the infant is ready for the process of separation to begin, and we are not quite sure how. How does she know this? Is it an instinct or a reflex of some kind? Is it biological? No one knows. Scholars like Winnicott believe that a disruption in the delicate mechanics and dynamics of these processes, and they are highly fine-tuned and very difficult, very easy to disrupt. These scholars believe that these disruptions can lead to pathological narcissism, of course, but also to schizophrenia, or at the very least, schizoid personality. Severe disruptions in the environmental provision during the early phase, severe failure on the part of the mother can lead to a panoply of mental illnesses. Today we know that schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and so on are probably biologically determined rather than autism spectrum disorder. There was a concept of refrigerator mothers. We don't believe in this anymore. Mothers are responsible for the development of some mental health issues, for example, some personality disorders. But genetics, hereditary load play a big role in mental illness. And this role has been underestimated until recently. And mothers tended to be accused disproportionately. The consequences of disintegration are disturbing for the infant. And so the infant compensates by attributing to itself control. This omnipotence, this grandiose, delusional self-perception as godlike, I'm in control of everything that's happening. I may be unintegrating or disintegrating, but I'm in charge of this process. This is what leads the baby, as I said, to explore the world, and this is the glue that holds the parts of the personality together, the glue that provides coherence to the baby's internal world. Of course, it is here that Winnicott came up with the idea of true self versus false self. And I want to clarify something. According to Winnicott, the false self is a spectrum. Everyone has a false self. While today we don't believe so. It is common to think that Winnicott conflated erroneously what Jung called the persona or Goffman called the mask with the false self. The false self is a pathological construct. And it is true that we present a facade, a socially acceptable, sublimated facade. When we go to work, when we date, when we interact with other people, in all interpersonal relationships, we have a mask that we wear. But this mask has nothing to do with the false self, at least psychologically speaking. And so Winnicott was wrong on that part. The true self, according to Winnicott, is founded on the idea of what he called the spontaneous impulse, the creative gesture. He said that whatever the baby does, the baby's attempts to detach itself, to define itself, to use the mother, to leverage the mother, to do so and so on, it's a creative process and it emanates from the truth self. The truth self is the developing ego. Although it's not exactly the same, there's still a big overlap. The function of the false self is to defend and protect the true self against annihilation. That's why Winnicott said that the false self and the true self develop simultaneously. There are varieties of false self on a spectrum. On the one hand, we have an extreme false self, an as-if personality, that's Deutsch. And this extreme is, for example, narcissism or borderline personality organization. This is ill health, this is mental illness. It's a false self masquerading as the true self. And the whole thing crumbles, becomes undone in interpersonal situations where the whole personality is required. Because the false self is an ingredient, a component of the personality. When it pretends to be the true self, it is inadequate in interpersonal relationships. So there, the imposter is exposed and the whole thing falls apart. And this is the core of the mental illness. But, said Winnicott, we have healthy false self. The healthy false self is protective of the true self and finds conditions in which the true self can flourish. It's a kind of guardian or custodian of the true self. The healthy false self is never completely discarded. It is, as Winnicott put it, represented by our polite and mannered social attitude. And that's, of course, his mistake. He's confusing mask or persona with false self. He says that the healthy false self provides space for the true self to exist without too much of a compromise of its integrity. And now we transition to Wilfred Bion. Bion worked not with children, but with psychotic and borderline psychotic patients. He suggested that containment is the mother's ability to manage her baby's pain, terror, negative effects. He left it open whether containment also contains aggression. Winnicott's idea of holding and Bion's idea of containing are often conflated and confused. They're not the same. In 2009, Ivy wrote that Symington and Symington's 1996 contention that holding is essentially positive, while the contained relationship may be destructive, this distinction is very true. One of the major differences that Ivy saw between the two concepts is that for Ivy, the Bionian baby has an innate awareness of his mother as something beyond or outside himself, whereas the Winnicottian baby needs to feel initially that his mother is an extension of him and hence not separate from him. Now you understand why Winnicott is much more useful. Winnicott's work is much more useful in the study of pathological narcissism. So what is clearly needed is some form of holding, some kind of treatment that the mother gives to a child that is distressed. The various ways in which we can offer holding to each other or containment. We're all in distress from time to time. We all experience distress, and we expect other people to hold us. The narcissist is an extreme case. The narcissist is in a constant state of distress. Narcissism can be reconceived as a form of prolonged grief, and I've dealt with this reconception in another video. So narcissist is always distress. There was a period where some scholars suggested that they suggested that pathological narcissism is a variant of depression. And so narcissists expect to be held all the time. Narcissists, in the early childhood of narcissists, there was no containment. The mother was not good enough. She did not provide an outlet to the child's aggression. She did not allow the child, ironically, to become sufficiently grandiose and omnipotent to take on the world. So the child retreated into fantasy and created there the missing dynamics. But within this fantasy, there must have been some kind of presence of the missing mother, or the absent mother, or the dead mother. And so the holding, when the narcissist wants you to hold him, he wants to reintroduce a substitute mother into the fantasy, thereby allowing him to obtain closure, to separate and individuate finally. It is crucial for babies, for adults, for patients to be held. It's a precondition for recovery. It allows people, being held allows you to discover a capacity for managing life and the difficulties of life without continued avoidance or suppression, as Caseman put it in 1985. And so psychoanalytic theory refers to the concepts of holding and containing to express the parallel of how a mother allows a child to express emotion while keeping the child safe, renders the expression of emotions secure, safe, non-punitive. A mother handles the infant's projection of painful, angry, unbearable feelings. She absorbs these emotions, negative effects from the baby. She takes them away from the baby. And then she processes these emotions and she returns these emotions to the baby in a modified, contained, loving way. So only in the sense of being or existing, the process of holding gives one, and I'm quoting Winnicott, the capacity to develop an insight, to be a container, to have a capacity to use the mechanisms of projection and introjection, and to relate to the world in these terms. Winnicott, therefore, did not entirely reject Bion's idea or Bion's approach of container and containment and contained. He did not reject it altogether. He did accept or consider projective mechanisms, but he made a condition. He said we can discuss containment, but only after we have had a period of holding that guides the infant towards independence, to engage in projection, projective identification, and to reciprocate in the process of containment, to hand over emotions, negative effects, to reabsorb them. All these are evolved functions, advanced functions. To get there, to accomplish these things, the baby first has to go through a period of holding, where the baby is merged and fused symbiotically with the mother and can't tell the difference. Bion saw the process of containment unfolding independent of any period of symbiosis or holding. He believed that the infant was able to be conscious of sense data from the beginning. Bion didn't suggest that because the baby is able to smell and to see and to hear, that gives the baby the ability to make use of these data. He just said that these incoming data, incoming sensor via the senses, define the baby, allow the baby to make sense of itself. He said that minute, when the baby is exposed to the environment, when the baby absorbs data through the senses, that minute the baby emerges, that minute the baby becomes. And it happens the first day or two after birth. It happens instantaneously. And then baby becomes. And then at that second, the baby has the capacity to use projective identification. Baby uses these processes, these defenses, to investigate, as Bion says, to investigate its own feelings in a personality strong enough to contain them. He said, it is the interplay through projective identification between the rudimentary consciousness and maternal reverie. He says the infant's development depends on this interplay. And so Bion is a lot more optimistic about the innate capacities of the baby, whereas Winnicott regards the baby as something very reminiscent of the blank slate, when the mother writes on this blank slate, and her writing and her input and her reactions create the individual, create the baby. Whereas Bion says, no way, baby is born fully equipped to process sense data and fully equipped to engage in primitive defenses such as projective identification. So baby immediately starts to interact with mother as two equals. And it is this process of interaction, projective identification, consciousness, and a reverie on the part of the mother, that gives rise to the baby, that triggers the development of the baby. The differences between the two approaches are subtle, but I think crucial. First of all, the Winnicott's mother, is involved in an imaginative exercise. She's using her own experiences, her own memories, to guide her adaptation to the infant. But her adaptation to the infant does not depend on communication from the infant, on some data, on some information, or on the infant exercising defenses such as projection and projective identification. The mother is constructed this way. She's programmed this way. And it's not dependent on the infant. Bion sees the mother's reverie, as he calls it, as the capacity to receive and respond creatively to the baby's projected chaos and confusion, as Isaac Elmhirst put it. So this is a crucial difference. In Bion's work, the baby triggers the development, its own development, using the mother. In Winnicott's work, mother creates the baby. Baby becomes through mother's gaze, but mother's actions do not depend on the baby or anything the baby has to say or communicate or do. So in Winnicott, the baby is passive. In Bion, the baby is active. Mother's ability to respond to projective identification is the core feature in Bion's work. He called it the normative scenario. He called it he used the word communication. For Winnicott, there's a personal core self at the center of which each individual, as he put it, is an isolate, permanently non-communicating, permanently unknown, in fact, unfound. There's an interesting bridge here with the work of Bolas and his unthought known, but I've dealt with it in other videos. You may wish to look it up. So what Winnicott means is that for the healthy development of communication in later life, there is a non-communicating central core. This is the true self. And this true self, this central self in the infant, has experiences of impingements, but they're very vague and very limited during the holding stage. And it is from here that gradually the baby emerges. There's a sense of aliveness, a sense of reality. I'm real. And it originates from this period of holding. In other words, according to Winnicott, the baby's interaction with reality is mediated via the mother's holding, mitigated, ameliorated, made tolerable, bearable, acceptable. Winnicott's view of motherhood and mothers is very benign. I would even say idealized. Whereas Bion's view is that the baby is born basically fully equipped, although consciousness is rudimentary and basic, everything is there, all the machinery is there. And then baby immediately starts to interact with mother by projecting onto her parts of itself, reabsorbing them, having been processed by the mother, and this way emerging and becoming, and baby is an agent, a change agent, in charge of everything that's happening. The second crucial difference between them is regarding the infantile ego. How inchoate is it? How cohesive is it? How innate is it? The rudimentary consciousness that Bion keeps mentioning, that is bestowed by this infantile ego. In Bion's conception, during the early stages of life, this ego and the consciousness field that it triggers, they give the infant an agency. This is an agency to manifest, to become, through the vehicle of projective identification, but still to become. It's a becoming, according to Bion, is an innate disposition, not an interactive outcome, or an outcome of interaction, not an artifact. Bion believed that even the most ideal and nuanced mother, environment, provision could not prevent later psychopathology if the infant possessed a highly aggressive, innate disposition. So here is a huge difference between Winnicott and Bion. Winnicott blamed mental illness on the wrong upbringing, on dysfunctionality in the interaction between mother and child, or on a dysfunctional mother. Bion said, we are born with the seeds of mental illness, for example, innate aggression. And there's nothing anyone can do, including a great mother, to prevent it. Bion, therefore, was more biological, his emphasis sounds a lot like some kind of genetic hereditary theory. Whereas Winnicott, and the vast majority of scholars actually, believe that even where there is a genetic predisposition, it takes trauma and abuse and a dysfunctional environment to trigger these genes, to express these genes, to bring about the pathology. And this seems to be the mainstream view nowadays, my view as well. Bion admitted that interventions, starting with early childhood, maternal interventions or parental interventions or interventions by teachers, role models, later therapists, and so on. He admitted that interventions could somehow ameliorate some of the disturbance, but never abolish it. It's never abolish it because it has nothing to do with the outside. Mental illness, psychopathology is innate. It comes from the inside, he said. In contrast to holding, the interaction of container and contained is not necessarily positive. It's not always growth promoting. This is a major difference between Winnicott and Bion. Winnicott assumes that if the mother is good enough, the interaction would always lead to good outcomes, would always end well, always result in a flourishing, mature, thriving, productive, happy, or content adult. Bion says no way. Even when the interaction is there, even when the containment is there, even when the projected negative effects of the baby are accepted by the mother, even then it could end badly. It could go awry somehow. It doesn't have, the results don't have to be positive or growth inducing. The interaction is capable of impeding or enhancing development. It could go either way, says Bion. And Bion described several pathological container-contained variants. He described the link between container and contained that was beneficial to growth, promoted growth of both the mother and the infant, and he called it commensal containment. In later work, Bion dwelled on these issues because he encountered enormous opposition, as you can imagine. So he tried to flesh it out. He tried to provide clinical examples and so on and so forth. And he divided the links between baby and mother into symbiotic links and parasitic links. And he said, by symbiotic, I'm quoting Bion, 1970. By symbiotic, I understand a relationship in which one depends on another to mutual advantage. By parasitic, I mean to represent a relationship in which one depends on another to produce a third, which is destructive to all three. So Bion, ultimately, having gone full cycle, having resembled Winnicott at some point, comes back full cycle to Klein. He remains faithful to the Kleinian conception of development, life, death instincts, originally proposed by Freud, which are innate. And he described the ways in which they could affect the interaction of the container and contained using this language. Don't forget that Freud was a neurologist, and he attempted to create a physics of the mind, something that is pretty deterministic. He believed in forces. He has psychic energy, later mislabeled cathexis. It's psychoanalysis. It's all very scientific. And so it's all innate. Freud would have felt totally at ease in today's environment where everything is attributed to genes and synapses in the brain. That was exactly how he started his career. He went to Paris to study neurology under the greatest names, Charcot and others. So Bion belongs in this school. Belongs in this school, which is, I would call it the deterministic school. The school of never mind the mother, never mind the environment. What decides the fate of the child as an adult is biology, innate drives. Winnicott objected to the concept of instincts, especially the death instinct. He hated it. He regarded destruction and self-destruction as a byproduct of what he called the primitive love impulse and aggression in later life. He said, we aggress against others and against ourselves when we are adults because we failed to develop appropriately as babies. We were failed. Someone failed us. We were frustrated. We did not receive early environmental provision. We didn't have a good enough mother. Bion introduced the term Reverie that I've mentioned a few times. And he described a process whereby the receptive mother takes on board the infant's hostile projective identifications. And she gradually sifts and distinguishes between the feelings and thoughts. She arranges them. She creates a nosology and a taxonomy and so on and so forth. She then compares the input from the baby to her own thoughts and experiences and emotions and so on and so forth. She allows everything to evolve into an understanding of what the baby is experiencing, and this is the reverie. The mother engages in reverie not only as a mirroring of the moods and impulses of the infant. The reverie allows the infant to develop a sense of self. And so in this sense, the reverie is an active engagement. And this is why I regard Bion's work as self-contradictory. On the one hand, Bion says that everything is essentially predetermined in the lottery of life, genetic, cerebral, something, neurological, and that the mother doesn't have much to do with the developmental and growth trajectory of later life, that pathology emerges regardless of the mother's input and conduct or misconduct. And this clash, head-on clash, with Winnicottian approach to personal growth and development, especially in early childhood, on the one hand. And suddenly you find in the work of Bion the concept of reverie, which, frankly, and to be charitable, is very reminiscent, to put it gently, of Winnicott's work. I don't want to use another word. Very reminiscent. So you have a Winnicottian foreign body inside Bion's work, because the reverie is Winnicott. It's a mother who is engaged, who is active, who is mirroring, who is fostering a sense of self in the child through her reflections, who is processing the baby's negative effects, handed over to her via projective identification, everything. Bion tried to square the circle by saying this entire process of projective identification and reverie is not driven by the mother, it's driven by the baby. And since the baby is biologically determined, he has innate tendencies like aggression, then it's not like Winnicott. It's not, the mother doesn't have much to contribute or to say because the baby is in charge. That's how he tried to square the circle. But I find it extremely not convincing. So this active engagement of the mother in Bion's work with the mother's engagement with the infant's mental state shows the infant how the infant's projection can be detoxified, metabolized. The mother is there, she accepts, the baby projects onto her negativity, the mother accepts this negativity and demonstrates to the baby that this negativity can be detoxified, metabolized, and become not so negative or even positive. The chaotic impulses of the baby, the sense impressions of the baby are tolerated. And it is with this maternal toleration that the baby loses the anxiety attendant upon the negativity. Initially, the baby is driven by this anxiety about the bad parts. So baby hands over the bad parts to the mother, and then the mother says, okay, not a big deal, not a problem. And baby relaxes, calms down. And now baby is able even to readopt these abandoned, rejected parts because the mother has rendered them innocuous. The mother's attitude to the bad aspects of the baby rendered the bad aspects non-threatening. Because the mother was not threatened by the bad parts of the baby. Baby doesn't feel threatened and now is able to engage with them in a way that is constructive and productive and leads to growth and development. Mother lends these parts shape and form that is non-hostile. It's incorrect to say that, and that's a very important distinction, because I keep giving you the impression that the baby hands over bad emotions, bad traits, bad aspects, bad dimensions, bad components, hands them over to the mother, and the mother accepts them and processes them. But it's very important to make a very subtle distinction here. What the mother is experiencing, these are not the actual feelings of the infant. A healthy, functional mother, a mother who is not mentally ill, who is not otherwise undisposed, or is a mother who is not experiencing the input or the feedback from the infant as her own, but she's flexible enough to allow the infant's projections to impact her cognitions, her emotions. In other words, at all times, she's able to make the difference, to tell the difference between her own psychological processes and the baby's. Whereas a mother who is not healthy, a mother without boundaries, a mother whose self, whose identity, and whose personality are in flux, identity diffusion, a mother who is empty inside, this kind of mother would appropriate the child's negative projections and make them her own, and would react to them as if they emanated from the inside, not from the baby outside. Again, it's a confusion between internal and external. A good mother, a good enough mother, in Winnicott's terms, a healthy mother shows how the baby's intense feelings can be tolerated, can be considered, can be reframed. Nothing happens. It's not the end of the world. No need for catastrophizing. At all times, though, she makes clear the difference between herself and these negative effects, these negative traits, this negativity emanating from the baby, so that the baby always is able to tell that this negativity that is being processed by the mother belongs to him, not to the mother. Otherwise, the mother would not be able to re-export these processed products back to the baby. Because the baby would reject them like some kind of foreign body. There'll be an immune response if the baby misidentifies these emotions as belonging to the mother. The infant's projection in Bion's work are founded, as I said, on sense data. In other words, they have a somatic, biological, physiological quality. Bion called them beta elements. And they are transformed by the mother into something more mental. So they start off as physical, according to Bion. Then they're projected, or this process of projective identification. And the mother converts them, reshapes them into mental elements. Mental elements that can be considered, discovered, thought of, subject to cognition, a different quality. And Bion called these alpha elements. So he said the mother converts beta elements, which are somatic, to alpha elements, which are mental. And there is a process known as the alpha process, or the alpha function. Now, this might begin to sound a lot like Kohut's transferences. It's not. To tell the difference, I encourage you to watch the video I've made about Kohut's transferences. I'll put some links in the description. In 1998, Waddell provided an example regarding this alpha process. And he tried to highlight the dynamic nature of the interaction between child and caregiver. Waddell, it's a she. Waddell described a situation where a young child is attempting to do a simple jigsaw puzzle. So he's fighting, he's trying to figure out where the pieces fit. It's not working well. The child becomes aggressive. It's a mess. And Waddell asserts that mothers in this situation may have a variety of responses, or even the same mother in different circumstances can respond differently. But she classified the whole universe of possible responses into 3 categories. And she said these categories illustrate the types of mother. So the first kind of response, the mother might see the child that is struggling, the child that is getting angry, the child that keeps failing to put the pieces of the puzzle together. She might see the child as a failure. She gets irritated that her child cannot complete a seemingly simple puzzle. The child picks up on this implicit criticism, on this rejection, on this disappointment. He picks up on it. And that makes the child even more anxious and less capable of completing the jigsaw. And finally, the child starts crying and leaves the room. So that's mother number 1. Mother number 2 realizes the child is struggling with the puzzle. And she believes that the child's problem will be solved if she were to step in and put the pieces in the correct place. So she appropriates the process. She takes over. The third type of mother engages with the child. She encourages the child to persevere, to be patient. She gives hints, but very disguised. So it's not taking over, it's not dominance, it's not direction, it's not instructions or commands. She just helps the child realize things by itself. She gets a feel for the child's level of distress. And so if the child tries to put the piece one way, she turns it a bit, and then the child sees the connection, and so on and so forth. So she has this background involvement that is not domineering. She helps the child to achieve a measure of autonomy through exercise. So what do we have here in terms of Bion's containment? In the first example, the mother fails to contain the child's anxiety. She maybe doesn't even focus on the anxiety as it is. The whole thing may be unthought. Maybe a sense of worthlessness and badness If the child is stupid, if the child is inadequate, and so on, it reflects on the mother. There's a lot of negative background interactions here, most of which are unconscious. But she lacks the ability to sit with the child and transform these feelings, these negative effects, including the anxiety, transform them into an energy source, something productive. And the result is that she picks up the negativity of the child, she amplifies it, and she, with her own negativity, and she returns it to the child. Of course, the child cries and runs away. In the case of the second mother, this second mother has some capacity to tolerate the child's anxiety. And she is able to act in a manner that she perceives as helpful to the child. Remember, this is the mother who takes over, completes the jigsaw puzzle on her own, allegedly, ostensibly demonstrating to the child how to do it. However, this kind of mother doesn't have the capacity to sit with the feelings that the child has projected. She cannot process them for long. She cannot contain them. She has an allergic reaction to them. She accepts them, she absorbs them, but then she needs to expel them. She can't sift through them, arrange them, organize them, reframe them, work out with them, whatever, try to understand what the child is really feeling or try to say. She doesn't have this. She doesn't have this. The child is not trying to communicate that it wants the puzzle to be solved. The child is trying to tell the mother about the intense distress that the child feels when it is faced with the prospect of having to do something without her. And she doesn't realize this. It is the child's independence of the mother that is threatening to the child. And when the child fails to put the jigsaw pieces together, there is this existential terror. I'm all alone, and I will never manage, and I'm as good as dead. And so this second mother can't go that deep, is unable to go that deep. She sees the immediate problem. There's a jigsaw puzzle, she put it together, problem solved. And repeated cycles of containment in this shape of dominating the child and the situation can lead to the internalization. Bion suggested that it can lead to the internalization of an object capable of tolerating enough frustration to avoid employing the mechanisms of evasion, but not enough to avoid developing a personality based on omniscience. So it's a very interesting distinction. Bion said if there's a child whose mother constantly confiscates the jigsaw puzzle, arranges it, puts it together by herself, and then presents it to the child, problem solved. No need for any negative effects. He said this kind of child would be able to tolerate frustration because mother is there and mother will solve the problem, so no need to be frustrated. Would not evade issues because there is a lot of kind of merger and fusion with the mother. The mother becomes the long arm of the child, you know. But this kind of child will develop a personality based on omniscience, on a narcissistic defense. To compensate for the child's inadequacy and inability to resolve the situation, to put the jigsaw puzzle together, the child would need to create a fantasy, to retreat, to avoid reality and retreat it into a fantasy where the child is omniscient and omnipotent. In short, the child will develop narcissism. And that's why everyone and his dog will tell you that domineering mothers, overpowering mothers, overprotective mothers very often produce narcissists. These kind of children generate an internal world that cannot survive without dictatorial moral strictures giving it some kind of coherence. Now, the third example, that's a mother who is sitting with the child's anxiety, embracing it, accepting it, adopting it, taking it away from the child, sifting through the signals and messages emanating from the child, through the uncertainty, for clues, as to what the child is trying to say, to communicate. And when this third mother intervenes, it is with an eye as to how the child is responding, with the sensitivity to the child. She's sensitive to the child. It allows the child to discover a sense of his or her own capacity. There's no imposition on the child. Cartwright suggested in 2009 the following: the drive towards knowing, curiosity, the ability to think amidst strong affect is a central part of the containing process. Knowledge, according to Bion, is the ability to think about something, and when you're able to think about something, you, by definition, you're tolerating it. So if you are able to think about your frustrations, to subject them to your cognitive processes, you're able to tolerate your frustrations. And this is the case in the third mother. You know, the desire to know and to understand is part of the child's need to project its feeling. There is a desire there to investigate this feeling in a personality strong enough to withstand the force. In other words, it's as if the child says, I'm having this bad feeling because I can't put the jigsaw puzzle together. I'm having this bad feeling. This bad feeling is all-pervasive. It overwhelms me. I don't know what to do. I'm in distress. I can't even identify this bad feeling. I can't give it a name. So I'm going to hand it over to mother because mother is safe. Mother is resilient. Mother is strong. She will hold this feeling for me. She will process it. She will take this challenge. She will sit with this feeling. She will sift for meaning. She will engage with me. She will teach me the meaning of this feeling through the interaction. The knowledge is in the interaction, not in the mother, not in the baby, not in the child, but the fact that the interaction between them leads to growth and development of both of them is the knowledge. What the child internalizes is an object that can make meaning. Always a mindful kind of meaning in the here and now. Whenever there's interactions, variety of different interactions. Thinking is not merely an imposition of logic and rationality. It is the courage to leap into the unknown and the capacity, as Sandler put it, to endure the yawning void while waiting for meaning to take shape. Klein, I mentioned that Bion was a big adherent of Klein. And so Klein suggested several things that Bion adopted. He dealt with primitive envy, and he elaborated how an innate disposition could interfere with the process of containment, and so on and so forth. Winnicott said, a baby can be said to live in a conceptual or subjective world. The change from the primary state to one in which objective perception is possible is not only a matter of inherent or inherited growth process. It needs, in addition, an environmental minimum. It belongs to the whole vast theme of the individual traveling from dependence to independence. Winnicott had this concept of holding, as I said. It's the notion that at the beginning of life, because the infant is in a state of primary unintegration, is not yet integrated, it's also a state of absolute dependence on the mother. So Winnicott's holding, the word holding, is not just the mother's, as he put it, actual physical holding of the infant, but also the total environmental provision. The total environment that the mother is creating for the child is the holding. Similarly, the mother's gaze is not only when the mother is looking at the baby, it's the mother's attention to the baby. It's creating an environment where the baby matters. What the good enough mother essentially does in the holding process is she provides a near perfect adaptation to the baby's needs. And this near perfect adaptation fosters continuity. The baby feels its own existence, experiences its own being as a continuous process, because it is continuously attended to in this perfect adapted environment. And this, of course, leads ultimately to integration. It emerges, therefore, that infants could exist in this crucial early childhood period in one of two modes: being, continuity, or annihilation. You know, adults can exist in many shapes, forms, circumstances, environments, and so on. Babies are not adults, even if we accept Bion's approach. Even Bion admitted that the consciousness is rudimentary. It's all very basic equipment. So the baby is binary. It can either exist, emerge, grow, become, or is dead, psychologically dead, annihilated. If the mother fails to identify with the infant sufficiently during the time of primary maternal preoccupation, if she does not provide the necessary adaptation, and then the infant panics. He becomes hysterical. He expends huge amounts of energy trying to trigger the environment, to provoke reality into becoming, into being. He then begins to misidentify reality with its own reactions, so this leads to an even more hectic cycle of reactions, impingements. As Winnicott says, the holding environment has as its main function the reduction to a minimum of impingements to which the infant must react, with resultant annihilation of personal being. And so in this state, the infant is absolutely dependent on the mother, is merged with the mother even. And the mother is merged with the infant. Don't forget, primary maternal preoccupation is a state of merger and fusion. That's why Mahler called the whole thing symbiotic phase. And it is through the process of holding that the infant, as Winnicott put it, changes from a relationship to a subjectively conceived object. Changes from a relationship to a subjectively conceived object, to an object objectively perceived. So the distinction between internal and external, subjective and objective, emerges at this stage. This is a direct outcome of the holding, the mother's holding, the mother's preoccupation. Winnicott says that this separation out of the mother, this separation of mother and infant, belongs to a later phase called living with, which succeeds the holding phase, but he still believes that it starts or is triggered by or generated by the holding phase. It's important at this point to remind everyone that Winnicott made a distinction between object relating and object usage. And this gave rise later to object relations. Yeah, Winnicott was one of the fathers of the British school of object relations in the 60s. So, object relating is relationships with subjectively conceived objects. And object usage is relationships with objectively perceived objects. And I think Winnicott's intention is that the infant becomes progressively more aware of the independent existence, the separateness and externality of the object, the mother, the object's survival of the infant's destructive attacks, Klein's envious attacks, Bion's projective identification. I mean, all these are destructive. All these are aggressive. The infant aggresses against the mother. The infant, having idealized the mother, having split and made the mother all good, in order to separate from her, the baby now must push her away, must devalue her in a way. Again, you see all the elements of the narcissist shared fantasy in action. And so there are destructive attacks, but the mother took them in stride. The mother tolerated them. The mother survived them. And most importantly, the mother continued to love the baby. And so the infant discovers the limits of its own power, the externality and independence of the object, mother. And there is a greater recognition in the infant of what is inside and what is outside. Winnicott believed that this capacity to use objects is a capacity that develops through the holding phase and into the living with phase, the second phase. And that a failure in maternal functioning and maternal provision in these phases leads to an infant that doesn't adequately recognize the object as an external phenomenon, with the result being a severe later life psychopathology. And this is at the core of pathological narcissism, this inability to tell the difference between external objects and the internal world. Winnicott's holding, he first used this term in 1953, and at that time he used it to describe the optimal environment for good enough parenting. He suggested that emotional problems develop when a person has been deprived of a holding environment in childhood, and that the level of holding was critical even in later life, for example, in a therapeutic or a clinical environment. So, a key function of the mother's holding is to insulate the baby from the impact of stress and anxiety by taking away these emotions, these effects, these states of mind from the baby, taking them away, carefully choosing the moments to allow for frustrations to be reintroduced slowly into the child's experience. It's a little, like when a baby cuts his finger, mother licks it, and it's all well. Same here. The holding experience, the holding process, is about mommy telling the baby, very often non-verbally, it's all going to be okay. Give me your pain. Give me your anxiety. Give me your frustration. I'm much stronger than you. I can hold it for you. And then when you're ready, I will hand them over. They're yours. They're not mine. I'm not absconding with them. They're here for you whenever you want them. And I'm going to give them back to you when you're strong enough, when you're resilient enough, when you're ready to regard them differently. For example, maybe you're able to reframe the frustration so that it's no longer frustrating. The good enough mother, says Winnicott, starts off with an almost complete adaptation to her infant's needs. As time proceeds, she adapts less and less completely, gradually, according to the infant's growing ability to deal with her failure. So a good enough parent gradually increases the amount of time between a child's emotional expression of a need or a reaction, for example, crying, and the meeting of this need, feeding, comforting. And this is the rejection I keep talking about when I say good mothers reject. And through this process, infants recognize that they can survive, that even when their needs are denied, they're still alive and well and thriving, that the dependency on the external objects can be minimized gradually over time, and that there is a me, there is a core, there is a self that is both distinguishable from and independent of external objects. The child learns that it can be overwhelmed by emotions and needs, but it needs to develop patience, to delay gratification, and to hope hope that the parent eventually will come and provide. Bion's containing, his theory, explains how a mother receives unwanted and/or overwhelming projections from an infant. And then she processes them and then returns the experience to the infant in modified, palatable form. And it is his view that infants become overwhelmed by their experience as they lack sufficient internal controls. The mother's containing function involves helping the infant develop a capacity for self-regulation. This self-regulation starts as external regulation. It is the mother that regulates the baby. The baby outsources regulation to the mother by observing the mother, interacting with the mother. When the mother allows the baby to self-regulate, gradually the child starts to regulate itself. There's no need for the mother's services anymore. It's like a training period. But if you remain stuck, if someone remains stuck in early childhood, they remain forever dependent on external regulation. This is the case in borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. The infant takes in, internalizes the sense of being contained, experiences the mother's emotional availability and resilience, and then eventually they develop their own capacity to do the same. By the way, Bion extended his work to social groups. He called them maternal containers. Some other lecture. Okay, so let's begin to wrap up. Container is a term coined by Wilfred Bion, 1962, to describe the maternal mind. Maternal mind receives the projections of the child, and by that very act makes it possible for the child to discover its needs. Bion proposed that the infant is not aware of its need. He is aware of an unsatisfied need, which he tries to get rid of. And this is very similar to Klein, with her work on good breast and bad breast. Bad breast is frustrating. If the mother provides the good breast, the infant gets rid of the bad breast, depositing it into the mother, according to Klein. And in my work and in Fairbairn's work, it's exactly the opposite, but I mentioned it before. And so the mother becomes not only the provider of literal nourishment, not only the provider of emotional succor, but she actually metabolizes the child's unpleasant feelings on behalf of the child. She becomes, in a way, an extension of the child's mind. And Bion regards this process as the original prototype for the capacity to think. He says that thoughts arise in the child's mind as sense perceptions and subjective experiences, but they are not processed until the mother emphatically deciphers these cognitions and returns them to the child as thinkable entities, or entities that can be processed cognitively. Of course, the child has to be able to tolerate some frustrations before receiving this kind of feedback, and the mother has to be receptive to the child's perceptions. So it's a very delicate dance. You can get it wrong, easy to get it wrong. Bion refers to maternal attitude, this maternal attitude, as container, reverie. So the container is structural, the reverie is the function. Gradually, the child internalizes the mother's attitudes and develops the capacity to think about her own thoughts. When the child receives this content from the mother, he arranges it. In Elements of Psychoanalysis, a book written in 1963 by Bion, he writes about the dynamic relationship between the container and the contained. And he mentions Klein repeatedly, and Klein's concept of projective identification. We're coming full circle to the beginning. He says that to become a psychic object, the projected element has to encounter a container or a thinking function, which is very interesting, by the way, because it means that in the future we'll be able to have the exact same process with artificial intelligence. The intrusive projected element is associated with uh, societal structures or societal thinking. In other words, the container in early childhood is the mother, but the container can be artificial intelligence, can be society at large, and beyond even linked some elements to masculinity, the intrusive projected element, and some elements to femininity, the containing receptive element, and so on. That's for another lecture where I will discuss the social thinking of several of these lesser known psychologies. Today, I dwelt at very great length on the initial, very early processes that lead to the emergence of compensatory mechanisms, the foremost among which is narcissism, pathological narcissism. You're beginning to see the connections between a lack of containment, a lack of holding, a mother who is not good enough, and the devastation this wreaks on the child's mind. And the child is unable to tell the difference between external and internal, unable to tolerate frustration, unable to reabsorb aggression, unable to engage in separation and become an individual, unable to have a self and an ego. The damage is catastrophic. It's a scorched earth. And the terrifying message about all this is that it's extremely easy to get it wrong.